A particle accelerator, or atom smasher, is a machine that uses superconductor magnets to make particles move at practically the speed of light. They're used to study the fundamentals of the universe by accelerating particles in a vacuum to nearly the speed of light and then smashing them together to record what happens. Particle accelerators are easily the most complicated machines on Earth. They're massive constructions containing thousands of superconductor magnets and billions of miles of wire. The mighty Hadron Collider, for example, contains 1.8 kilometers of wire, which is enough to line a path from Earth to the Sun 6 times. Imagine one of these, but Soviet. It was called the U-70 synchrotron, and that is what a Soviet scientist named Anotolio Bugorski was working with at the Institute for High Energy Physics in Protvino, Russia. On the 13th of July 1978, Bugorski was running an experiment with the colossal synchrotron, but his progress was halted when the machine reported an error. Bugorski, through his experience, knew what needed to be done to solve the problem. However, he needed to check some components of the most dangerous part of the machine, the inside of it. As you can imagine, there were rigorous safety protocols in place. Bugorski asked the control room to shut the machine down, and 5 minutes later, perhaps earlier than expected, he arrived at the entrance to the machine, or at least the part he needed to get into. As this was the spicy end of the machine, there was a locked door, and next to the door was a warning light. The light was illuminated to indicate the machine was on. And at this moment in time, it was off. The door was also electronically locked when the machine was on, and Bugorski found the door unlocked, and having already informed the control room he was going in, Bugorski assumed everything was shut down. Being an experienced operator, he obviously had doubts about being able to access the chamber so easily and so quickly. But as the light was off, the door was open, and the control room knew his plans, he proceeded anyway. The machine is essentially a long circular tube about the width of a basketball. This tube is where the atoms travel in a big loop. The part that Bugorski needed to check was on the inside of this tube, and so to check it, he had to stick his head inside. But here is where a problem occurred. Inside the chamber, pockets of protons were still flying silently and invisibly through the open air, and there was an invisible pulsing beam between where he was and where he needed to be. So when he bent down to check the instrument, a concentrated beam of trillions of ultra-relativistic protons moving at 670 million miles per hour pierced through his head. The subatomic particles, each carrying 7.6 billion electric volts of kinetic energy, effortlessly entered through the back of his head, passed through his middle ear, through his occipital and temporal lobes, and then blasted out of his left nostril. He later reported he felt no pain, and reported seeing a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns. He instantly knew what happened, and probably that he was already a dead man. However, incredibly, Bugorski wasn't instantly killed as you may expect. Instead, he calmly finished his inspection, logged it in a journal, and then without saying a word to anyone about it, he went home. The next morning, he was brought before doctors as the left side of his head had swollen and the skin around the invisible entry and exit injuries was peeling off. After running some calculations on just how much radiation he had experienced, they reached a chilling and inevitable conclusion. Bugorski was going to die, and fast. The radiation dose at the entry point was 200,000 Röntgens, and at the exit, 300,000. In theory, 100,000 Röntgens of radiation is over 1,000% lethal and would typically kill a human within just an hour, even with the best medical care on the planet. and that's a third of what he experienced. Being the first person in history to ever experience such a thing, he became a subject of interest to scientists around the world, hoping to gain extremely valuable data on how fast and horribly Bugorski would die after being hit in the head by a proton beam from a particle accelerator. But hours passed. Then days passed, and Bugorski was still alive. So why didn't he die that day? Bugorski's head was hit by trillions of protons moving at near light speed, but because protons are so unfathomably small, and human flesh isn't thick enough to stop them, most of the protons simply passed through him. Mostly they passed through without even bumping into anything. Basically, the human body isn't enough to stop the beam, so almost none of the energy in the beam gets transferred to the body. To the U-70, you are basically a ghost. Also, the fact that he crossed the beam the way he did is of course a miracle, and it's pure luck that the path the beam took through his head somehow managed to miss critical brain areas and blood vessels. But still, the tiny fraction of energy he absorbed that day changed his life forever. Anatoly Petrovich Bugorski, the first and only man to take a particle accelerator beam to the head, is still alive right now as I speak. Over 45 years after the incident that changed his life, he lost his sense of hearing in his left ear. The veins on the left side of his head were burnt, and he also suffers from seizures. He almost got time-defying superpowers for the experience. Since the nerves on the left side of his face were destroyed, only half of his face responds when he makes facial expressions. So the left side of his face remains wrinkle-free, and so apparently looking younger. However, proton beam to the head is not a recommended anti-aging treatment.